Hey guys, welcome back to Horsetooth Cinema. We're back on the My Favorite Movies series that I've been doing. I've done Donnie Darko, and now I've done Zodiac as well. But it's been a while since I've done one, and I thought I would bring you a review for a movie that has recently just become one of my favorites. And that movie is Barry Lyndon, directed by Stanley Kubrick. That came out in 1975. So Kubrick obviously needs no introduction. He's widely considered one of the greatest filmmakers to ever live. And I think for good reason. He's known for tackling a very wide variety of genres throughout his filmography, and making a very great film in each genre. Excluding some of his earlier work, he's made arguably some of the greatest films in genres like gladiator epics, noir films, horror, sci-fi, dystopia, and arguably with this movie, Barry Lyndon, kind of historical costume dramas. He's made some movies that are some of my favorite films of all time. Of course, I'm thinking of stuff like 2001: A Space Odyssey or The Shining. 2001 is really just, one of the greatest achievements in the history of film. And he also made The Shining, which is one of my favorite horror films ever. So yeah, I love those two. And then there's Barry Lyndon. Now, with those other two movies I mentioned, I have a deep love not only for the films themselves, but also the genres of horror and sci-fi. It's just something that I very easily latch onto as a person. But that's not necessarily true with Barry Lyndon. I mean, it's a historical costume drama, ostensibly. And I often dismiss films like that as usually Oscar bait or they have this sort of pretentious perceived importance about them that I'm just not really a fan of. And I think that's a huge reason why a lot of people haven't seen this movie in comparison to a lot of Kubrick's other films, like the ones I mentioned, or even something like Clockwork Orange, Eyes Wide Shut, Full Metal Jacket. It's a little bit more of an intimidating watch, I think. I mean, it's 3 hours long. It's, again, a period piece costume drama set in the mid to late 1700s. I'm not gonna lie, when I first heard about it, it just looked really boring. Not to mention that, again, I already kind of struggle with historical films anyway, especially those that portray an entire life of a person. I mean, if you saw my Elvis review, I got into some of my issues with those kind of films generally, but I really think it's hard to reduce an entire life to a 2 or even a 3 hour movie without just sort of feeling like it's hitting the sort of generic beats of a life over and over again. And that's kind of how I felt about that movie. But the other thing is that a lot of these films are about real people. And I think when you're making a film about somebody who is a real person that lived, there's a tendency to overly revere this person, as opposed to make them be a real character with flaws and such. And they often don't have great arcs either, which is a problem when you're trying to tell a story. I think that a lot of the times the filmmakers they want to be too true to history as opposed to, telling an interesting narrative that's based on history. And I think that would be fine if this were a history class, but if you're trying to, again, tell an interesting story or trying to get into the headspace of a character, it doesn't really work for me. But why I really love Barry Lyndon is that it doesn't suffer from those problems at all. While the story does span many years, it's not trying to cover Barry's entire life or anything. It's just focused on his rise to power and his fall from grace, a very classic Hollywood story that we know. And because it's the adaptation of a novel as opposed to the life of a real person, it can portray these events in a way that does lend itself to good storytelling. So let's just get into it. Barry Lyndon is about a man named Redmond Barry, who is a young Irishman who begins the film lusting after his cousin. She seems to think it's just a flirt, but he seemed to think it was something a lot more, so Barry challenges her fiancé to a duel in which he wins. And because he seemingly killed her fiancé, he has to flee. This sets him off on an adventure that encompasses the rest of the film, and includes Barry fighting in a war, becoming a renowned gambler, and eventually marrying into the incredibly wealthy Lyndon family. So it's basically a historical epic, but it's missing something that's usually at the center of these kinds of movies. And that's a character that we, as the audience, can generally revere, as we tend to with historical figures, and just get behind in general. And that's really interesting to not have that. Characters in these movies are often portrayed as heroes, but not Barry. He's really just written as a little shit. Almost everything he does throughout the entire runtime is done for selfish reasons, and although he acquires a great deal of money and power, he doesn't really accomplish anything himself. It's not because he's earned these things that he has these things. It's usually just him swindling his way into the most, favorable position. And some might see this as a flaw with the film because, we don't have somebody that we can latch onto. I personally don't really necessarily look for characters that you have to like. I just need characters to be interesting. But with Barry, because we don't unnecessarily revere him in the way we do with a lot of historical characters, we're able to understand him a little bit better just as a person. Again, I think sometimes these movies, they have a reverence for the character, but they forget that these historical figures, especially if they're about real people, they're just people. They're just people who lived once. They likely aren't very sympathetic people, especially ones who have gained a lot of wealth or power, especially historically, but even now, that doesn't necessarily happen with meritocracy. It happens by, either being born into it or being a con man, being a swindler. And that's exactly what Barry does. The movie opens with a scene of Barry playing a card game with his cousin, and it's a very sexually charged scene. And you can tell that Barry is fascinated with the situation. But at the same time, it's clear that his cousin has all the power in this situation. The way that Kubrick shoots it, from the opening scene, we really see the weakness of our historical epic protagonist. And we see how pathetic he's going to be portrayed because, not only is this, does his cousin have all the power in this situation, but she's also his cousin, so that's a layer of patheticness in itself. And there's so many more examples of the pathetic nature of Barry throughout the movie. He deserts his regiment, and when he's caught, he has to join the Prussian army. He gains very short-lived respect there, but eventually he has to flee as a partner of the very man that he was supposed to spy on when he was a member of the army. He then marries into the Lyndon family, but once there, he starts cheating on his wife repeatedly. It's a very unusual, but also a very effective way to draw out a character in a movie like this. But the really interesting thing to me about the movie is that despite all of this, the pathetic nature of him and the way we're not supposed to sympathize with him, despite that, Kubrick does get you to invest and be interested in this man's life. And I think part of that is just that the movie is so grand in scale. Every frame of this movie looks like it could be a painting in a museum. I mean, it is just one of the most gorgeous movies you will ever see. And the production design and the period detail is just unmatched. I've never seen anything like this. But I think part of it also has to do with the latter half of the film. Once Barry has sort of acquired his power and has become a part of the Lyndon family, especially once he's settled into it for a little while, he now realizes that he doesn't have to claw his way to the top anymore. And that does lead to just sort of him indulging even further, like I mentioned, cheating on his wife. But eventually, it sort of puts everything in perspective for him, and he actually is able to develop some redeemable qualities. He and his wife reconcile. He sort of confesses his love to her, and they seem to be doing a little bit better. And he also is being a good father to his biological son. And it's right in that moment where things seem to be going the best for Barry, where he finally seems to be developing some redeemable qualities. That's when we really experience the true tragedy of the movie. So first of all, his biological son is killed in a horseback riding accident, and then his stepson, who he's been feuding with for the entire movie, the two really don't have much love for each other. His stepson challenges him to a duel. Now, this duel scene is probably my favorite scene in the movie. Just the way, Kubrick's always really good at using music, but the way he uses the low strings in this scene and the way that builds tension is just unreal. It really adds a biting sense of anticipation to everything. And in this duel, there's a moment where we think Barry is going to complete his arc and that he's going to have the ultimate redemption in his story, because his stepson wins the draw to shoot first, but the son's pistol accidentally goes off before he can even aim it. And that sets us up for the final way in which Barry will use luck to his advantage. He's supposed to, he gets lucky with this scenario and he's just supposed to go ahead and shoot his son. But no, he doesn't do that. He instead fires his own pistol into the ground and offers his stepson a truce. Finally shows his stepson humility, but his stepson won't accept it at all. He says that he hasn't achieved satisfaction. And so he just takes his pistol right back and shoots Barry in the leg, which later they have to amputate. And after the amputation, Barry is literally a broken man. He's run the Lyndon estate into the ground, and he's forced to return to Ireland, basically, and live out the rest of his days with his mother. And there is definitely a Freudian quality to her character, how she sort of controls things that Barry does throughout the movie. So it's interesting that that's where he ends up at the end. But I think that the ending really reinforces what Kubrick is ultimately trying to say with the film. No matter how grand historical figures seem to be, no matter their journeys, they're still really small in the grand scheme of things. Barry ends up in this story exactly where he started, living at home with his mother. And the movie ends with an epilogue card, which I personally find to be just bone-chilling. It was in the reign of George III that the aforesaid personages lived and quarreled. Good or bad, handsome or ugly, rich or poor, they are all equal now. In other words, historical figures do not matter. No person is really worthy of an epic in the grand scheme of things. We're all reduced to ashes by the end. So yeah, Barry Lyndon is, without a doubt in my mind, one of the best movies ever made. I discovered it earlier this year, and I've watched it a couple times since then, and it's just grown on me more and more, to the point where I think it's my favorite Stanley Kubrick movie. And I think that might be a little bit of a hot take with some people, but yeah, I don't know, this one just resonates with me the most. Maybe it's just because it's so different from, normal historical costume dramas, and it really made me understand why people are drawn to these movies. Ironically, it made me understand that by doing things so differently than those films normally do. But yes, after watching it, I really can understand the appeal of these kinds of movies. And again, I know this looks like an intimidating watch. Again, the runtime is really long, it looks boring, but trust me, it's one of the most entertaining movies I've ever seen. Of course, I'm giving it 5 stars, and I highly, highly recommend it. I believe it's on Canopy, by the way, which is a nice free streaming service. So basically, you just can subscribe with a library card, and you get 4 free movies a month, which is really, really cool. So yeah, check it out there. That's going to do it for this video. If you guys like the video, you can like it down below, and subscribe to the channel if you want. I've got more content coming out soon, and I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya.